Hello and welcome back, Social 20. So, what we're going to talk about today is something called a contending loyalty. So, we have looked at different aspects of nationalism, we've looked at different groups, how they've defined themselves within nationalism. And what we're going to talk about today is what happens perhaps when we have loyalties that might clash. So, when we're talking about loyalty to a nation, it can sometimes mean, do we have to give up loyalties to something else? Or is there a way that we can try to figure out a way to be loyal to two things? So what we're going to start by looking at today is our lesson objectives. And then we're going to do quickly a review about the emergence of a nation and how do they form. So when we talked about a nation, we really defined it more as that sense of feeling, collective consciousness. It's a belonging, but it doesn't have to be necessarily physical. So we talked about a group of people that shared the same beliefs, values, goals, interests. They might share the same geography, ethnicity, but they're not necessarily they don't necessarily share a border. So when we looked at, let's say, religious nation, there were lots of different religions practiced all over the world. They didn't need to be within the same group to have those same beliefs. So when we also looked at the definition of a nation state, it is a country that has physical borders and a central government. Now, the sense of a nation state is defined in one or two ways. In the past, a nation state was formed by a group that had similar characteristics in ethnicity, and then they kind of drew borders around them. But when we think about how a lot of nations have emerged and evolved nowadays, we think about what's called a civic nation, in which we have a shared sense of beliefs and values and goals, and then we have a border around us, but it does not necessarily mean it was rooted in our ethnicity. So when we talk about a nation state, they can be one of the two. They can be based on ethnic nationalism. We still see those kind of countries. They have closed borders. They don't allow immigration. We think about North Korea, who is not open to any sense of, change within their society. And then we have, nations such as Canada, which are based on multiculturalism, which practice civic nationalism, or it can actually be kind of a combination of the two of them together. So when we look at the concept of ethnic nationalism, this is a bit of a review. It really is how nationalism evolved. It was a set of people with a shared sense of ethnicity, for example, and it led to a shared sense of nation. Then those people came together to try to create a nation state, live together with others who shared their sense of nation. So when we look at example on the map here to the right, Germany emerged from a union of German-speaking states. So there was a lot of different areas in Germany, and they kind of came together because they had a sense of similarity in their German descent. So they were very spread out. They kind of had, they needed to be what's called unified. So they had a lot of different areas with people of German descent, and they wanted to come together to put borders around this one large area, call it Germany, and they shared a German descent. When we talk about civic nationalism, it's really people who are choosing to live under a shared set of values, not necessarily a shared culture or ethnicity or religion or language. And this is often expressed in a constitution. So in Canada, we looked at previously our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Characteristics of these nations typically evolve over time, and there's amendments. We amended our own constitution in 1982 to involve multiculturalism. And over time, common values and beliefs are really the cornerstone for that nation's similarity. It doesn't have to do with a shared culture or ethnicity. So when we look at to the right here, Great Britain, this is a nation made up of 4 nations actually, and all kind of sharing that same similar sense of values and beliefs. Just to review, when we look at what patriotism is, it's really the emotion behind the display of the love for your country. So it's really love for one's country, and it's also always born out of a sense of loyalty. So when we're talking today, we're going to look at some of the loyalties that can clash, especially related to your nation, your country, where your nationalist loyalties can lay. So when we're talking about contending loyalties, it is any loyalty that competes. To be in contention means to have a fight or a conflict. So contending loyalties are the same thing. They are loyalties that are conflicting. People sometimes need to choose a side or a loyalty or a commitment that they need to make on one of two sides. So when we're talking about loyalties, it can be really hard to figure out what side you should be on. I'm sure perhaps maybe not in a nationalist sense. You've been in the situation where you had to choose a side on something. So maybe you were, let's say, born in Edmonton, but now you live in another city and you have this kind of sense of loyalty to the Oilers, but now maybe they're playing, another hockey team. Where does your loyalty lie? Does it lie in the new city? Does it lie to your roots? There's always these sense of loyalties that we need to choose. So what we're going to look at today is what are some of these loyalties, and especially related to nationalism. So one of the things, we just talked about this. Have you ever had to make a choice between loyalty to two different groups? So you either had to, let's say, you couldn't choose to go both to your soccer practice and to study with, other members in your class for a test. So where was your loyalty? Was it to go play with your sports teams, or was it to your classmates in that class to work on a group project? So what are typically some of the consequences of choosing your loyalty? Well, when we think about that, it tends to be situations where maybe you have to let one side down, or maybe, you have to maybe not do the thing you want to do, but it is probably better for your future or your goals. So when you're thinking about a loyalty, what we're going to focus on today, we will talk about loyalties that are not related to nationalism later. But today, can you think of a contending loyalty in Canada? When we're talking about contending loyalties, I would, sometimes think it could be a conflict for someone who's moved from another country. They come into Canada, they want to keep their cultures and they want to keep aspects of it, but they also want to adopt some perhaps of the Canadian values or things around them that might be in conflict. So if they have a special holiday that is celebrated on a day in Canada that we have school, there may be a choice between, do I go to school or do I celebrate the holiday in kind of some sense of loyalty to my country? Those are really tough decisions for people to make. So we're going to look at two specific examples of contending loyalties specifically to Canada and Canadian nationalism. And one of them is Quebec. When we look at Quebec's culture and we talk about their language and their sense of, unique culture that has really sometimes been challenging for them to pursue, it's something that we need to understand as Canadians. So we have had a large history in Canada of Quebec being, at times fighting for their culture, at times feeling as though they were not a part of Canada. And this really kind of culminated and came to a decision that the country had to make in 1995. So it was October of 1995, and the whole country got to vote in what's called a referendum. So a referendum is different than an election in that it is a situation where only one question is on the ballot and people have to just choose. Usually it's just a straight yes or no. So a referendum is not used very often, especially in a large country with this many people, because it's really hard to, it's expensive to hold referendums. It's really hard to get the resources to do it. So we don't often have referendums. Smaller countries do more often. So in October 1995, the country had to vote whether Quebec should separate. And it didn't mean they were going to float away from Canada. It just meant they were going to have their own sense of nationhood. So there was a lot of questions around what kind of passport would they have? Would they share our healthcare system? Would they share our money? It was really about setting themselves apart as a distinct nation apart from Canada. So this was an interesting debate in Canada at the time, and it forced people who were Quebecois to choose between their loyalty to support Quebec as a unique province, but then they also had loyalty to Canada as a nation. And it was really hard for them to decide between, well, do I identify myself as a Canadian or a Quebecois? I can't be both. And it really led to a lot of conflicts in loyalty. People at the time were very divided on this issue. And a lot of news reporters would go into communities in Quebec and they would ask questions, and it was really interesting to see people's personal opinions towards this. So it ultimately, if you were living outside of Quebec, you didn't have as much of a sense of a loyalty to Quebec because you didn't live there if you were not attached to it. So it was a different loyalty that was being called upon to people who lived in Quebec. And so everybody voted in October of 1995, and the vote was very closely divided, of course, ultimately. There's no spoiler there. Quebec's still a part of Canada. So the country voted Quebec stays as a part of Canada. It's very close. It was like 50.5 to no to 49.5. So, I mean, it was so close to almost them separating from Canada. So you can understand the separatists is the name for someone who supported Quebec moving away from being ruled under Canada. And the people who wanted to stay were called federalists. Federalists refers to the country as a whole. So when we had the separatists and the federalists, it became really a contentious issue, and people were asked to identify what side they were on, and it stirred up a lot of loyalties, and it was a really contentious issue. It hasn't been explored in as much rigor since then, but it still is a unique situation in our country with Quebec's culture and Quebecois, and it definitely is still a sense of loyalties that I think still are called upon on a lot of Quebecois. The second issue we're going to look at is what was called the Oka crisis. There's a really good write-up in your textbook, and there's videos you can find of what is called the Oka crisis. The Oka crisis happened in the 90s, and it was between two groups mainly, really. It was between the tribe, the Mohawks that were living in this area that's called Oka, and it was between really ultimately the government, but the people who kind of stood on the other side. And so what it was about was the government wanted to propose the idea of a public golf course that was going to be built upon a cemetery that had a lot of significance and spiritual connections to the Mohawk group in Oka. And so ultimately it was violent. It was a violent clash. They did send in the military, and the Mohawks physically blocked the government from being able to access the site. And so it wasn't about a golf course. It was about the values below that. And it was about that this had a spiritual meaning, significance, and a very tight connection to the land. And they wanted to use it as, a public recreation area. And so this really became about, do we respect our First Nations culture, their spirituality, their individuality, and they felt very disrespected. And so they had to kind of have that loyalty that, yes, they're Canadians and they understand that they are, part of the public, but they also had a unique culture that was within Canada. And this was really, to them, a very large issue. So ultimately, the government decided, but people were killed. There was violence. There was military brought in. There's videos you can look up to see just how it affected not only the Mohawks. It was really about larger groups who started to come in and protest, and it was about really this feeling of disrespect towards our Mohawk peoples in that area. So ultimately, the government did decide that they were not going to build on it, but it really became a clash in loyalties between this group who had a unique culture and sense of spirituality and connection to the land, but also they were Canadians as well, and there was a large conflict there. So when we're talking about the Oka crisis, who were the stakeholders? That means who were really the people who were involved in it. And it's the government and it's the Mohawk people. And the contending loyalties dividing them we talked about. It was the sense of spirituality and the sense of respect for the culture versus also the government's need and wants for a recreation area. So do you think that these kind of conflicts and the respect for First Nations land and culture has been resolved in Canada today? This was 1990. Are we still seeing some of these issues today? It's something to think about. If you can think even recently about perhaps something you've seen in the news that might be very similar. There was a pipeline protest that's really interesting to look up as well, if you want to kind of explore if these contending loyalties are still present and still in conflict today in Canada. For a large number of both of those, actually, Quebec and First Nations, the answer is yes, there still are those contending loyalties there. So when we're talking about now trying to reconcile the relationship, let's say, between the First Nations and the government? Did the use of force and bringing in the military and throwing, the smoke bombs in that they're trying to kind of quell people back, is that going to help this process? And how important it is to achieve reconciliation between these loyalties within Canada. Is there a point where people should have to choose? Do I have to choose between being a Canadian and a Quebecois? Can I be both? Or do I have to choose between being a Canadian and a First Nation? And why do I have to kind of choose which one is more important? And so when we're talking about reconciliation of them, what we're going to look at next time is we're going to explore what are some of the ways. We're going to look at 3 very distinct ways people can reconcile loyalties that clash, and how are some of the ways to deal with contending loyalties. Should people have to choose? Is there a way to not choose? And those are some of the things. It's very individual, personal decision. When we talked about perspective earlier in the course, you have to remember that there's really no right answer for that. It has to be people's individual experiences are going to be different, and it's going to be a different experience for them. I'll see you next time.
If you enjoyed this video, check out our website, online.plrd.ab.ca, and visit us on Facebook, Prairieland Online Academy. You can find out all that's going on with Prairieland Online Academy.